There is a thing the sea does with the dead that the land does not do. The land keeps them. The land receives what is placed in it, and it holds it, closes over it, grows above it. And if it is a good burial in a marked place, then the place becomes the address of the dead, the specific coordinate where the dead are located, where the living can go when they need to stand near something that was once a person they loved and find the specific comfort of knowing where the person is, which is a comfort the grieving need, and which the land is very good at providing, because the land stays where it is, and what is put in the land stays where it is put, and the address does not change. The sea is a different archivist. The sea receives what is placed in it, or what falls into it, or what is swept into it by the specific violence of the occasions when land and sea argue about their boundary, and it does not keep what it receives in the way the land keeps. It moves what it receives. It carries. It distributes. It takes the dead from the place where they died, and it puts them somewhere else. And the somewhere else is determined by the currents and the winds and the tides and by whatever the sea, which has been moving things across the face of the planet since before there were people to watch it move, determines is the correct destination. Sometimes the destination is nowhere. Sometimes it is the deep floor, the specific deep cold of the ocean's lowest reaches, where the pressure is so extreme that nothing decomposes at the rate it would decompose in the warmth above, where things are preserved in the darkness in a way that is nothing like the preservation of the grave, not the deliberate, arranged preservation of a burial, with its ceremony and its marker and its address, but the accidental, absolute preservation of the deep cold, where things that fall to the bottom simply remain, suspended in the pressure, carried nowhere, held there for as long as the bottom of the ocean remains the bottom of the ocean, which is a very long time. But sometimes the sea takes the dead somewhere specific. Sometimes the currents that run through the ocean the way rivers run through the land, the specific rivers of warm water and cold water that have been flowing in their courses since the Atlantic was the Atlantic, and that move with the authority of things that are not going to be redirected by anything a human being could arrange to do about them. Sometimes these currents take what they have been given and carry it, with the specific patience of something that is in no hurry because it has been moving in this direction for longer than the concept of hurry has existed, from one place to another. This is the story of the coffin that the sea carried. This is the account of what the sea decided to do with the body of a man who died far from home and was buried on a flat island that was not his home, and was then collected by the sea during the worst storm in American history and was carried across 2,000 miles of open Atlantic to the red sand shore of the place where the man had been born. This is the account of Charles Coghlan and the journey his coffin made after the hurricane of September 8, 1900. This is what the wood remembers. Charles Francis Coghlan was born on Prince Edward Island in the year 1841, in the specific circumstance of an Irish family on a Canadian island. The particular displacement of people who had come from one island to another island and had found in the second island's particular quality of light and soil and sea air something that was not the first island, but that was, in the specific way, the islands of the North Atlantic, recognizable as belonging to the same family of place, the same category of sky and shore, and the cold, clean light of the North Atlantic that is different from any other light in the world. He grew up knowing that light, and then he left. He was the kind of man who leaves the place where he grew up because the place where he grows up is not large enough for what he is, and what he was an actor. A man who could put on other people as naturally as other people put on clothes, who could stand on a stage and be something the audience needed him to be, and be it so completely that the audience forgot he was being it, which is the highest achievement of the theatrical craft, and which Charles Coghlan had in a degree that made him, by the 1880s, one of the most celebrated stage actors in Britain and North America. He performed in London and in New York, and in the cities of both continents that mattered to the theatrical world of the late 19th century, which was a world of extraordinary vitality and social significance, when the stage was still the primary cultural institution of a society that did not yet have the cinema or the radio or the other technologies that would later divide the audience's attention. He performed Shakespeare, and he performed the fashionable drawing room dramas of the period, and he performed the melodramas that the popular audience demanded and that the serious theatrical critics found beneath him, because the popular audience was always somewhere he was willing to go, even when the critics preferred he stay on the elevated ground. He was celebrated, and he was difficult, in the specific way of celebrating actors who understand the rarity of what they have and who have accordingly little patience for the compromises that working in large institutions with other people requires. He was celebrated and he was generous in the way of people who have given everything they have in the performance and who are therefore depleted in the ordinary social operations that other people find easy. He was celebrated and he was mortal, which is the category that finally matters, which is the category that Galveston in November of 1899 settled for him. He was performing at the Tremont Opera House in Galveston, Texas, on a tour of the Gulf Coast when he fell ill. The illness was the kind that actors who are past middle age and have spent their careers in drafty theaters and damp dressing rooms, and the general physical precariousness of a touring life accumulate gradually and then succumb to suddenly. The illness of a body that has given a great deal and is presenting the accounting. He died on the 27th of November, 1899, which was the last day of November's first week, which was the season when Galveston's Gulf breezes were still warm enough to be pleasant, and the city was at its most beautiful. Its Victorian houses bright above the Gulf, the seawall not yet built. The seawall that would come after the disaster of the following September. Too late for the 300 blocks of the city that would be destroyed. Too late for the 8,000 people who would die. He was buried in Galveston's Catholic cemetery. The burial was according to the form. The lead-lined coffin, the sealed lid, a silver nameplate, the grave in the Catholic section of the cemetery. The grave had an address. The dead man had a location. The land had received him, and the stone above him said where he was. 9 months later, the hurricane came. The storm that crossed the Gulf of Mexico in the first week of September 1900 was not unusual in its origin. Tropical systems had been forming in the warm waters of the Atlantic and curving westward into the Gulf since before anyone was recording them. Since before anyone was recording anything. Since the Gulf of Mexico, with the Gulf of Mexico, and the warm water, and the specific pressure systems of the late summer tropical atmosphere, were producing exactly this kind of storm on a regular schedule that no human institution had yet developed the capacity to predict with the accuracy the schedule required. What was unusual about the storm of September 8, 1900 was its landfall. Galveston is a barrier island. It is a long, narrow strip of sand and shell and the specific low Gulf Coast topography that the Texas shore produces barely above sea level at its highest point, surrounded on three sides by water. The Gulf of Mexico to the south and east, Galveston Bay to the north, and the channels and inlets that the tidal system has cut through the island over centuries. It is a beautiful place, as certain places that are at the precise margin of two systems are beautiful. The ocean and the land and their specific argument along the shoreline. The Gulf light very particular, very warm. The color of the water in the shallower inlets an extraordinary blue-green, that is the specific color of warm shallow Gulf water, and that exists nowhere else in exactly that shade. It is also a place with nowhere to go. When the storm surge came, the wall of water that a major hurricane pushes ahead of itself as it moves toward the shore, the specific ocean, lifting phenomenon of a pressure system so intense that it raises the sea beneath it and drives that raised sea ahead of it. When the storm surge came to Galveston on the afternoon of September 8, 1900, the island had no elevation to retreat to. The water came from the Gulf on the south side and from the bay on the north side, and the island was underwater. Houses were swept away with their occupants inside. Buildings that had been standing for 30 years were reduced to the materials they had been made of. The streets became the sea. The seawall had not been built yet. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. The range is still that wide, more than a century later, because the destruction was so complete that the census of the living was the primary method of counting the dead, and the census of the living after the storm was conducted in a city where a quarter of the population was gone, and the counting has never been fully resolved. The Catholic cemetery was in the path of the storm surge. The storm surge that crossed the low ground of the island lifted the soil of the cemetery and the graves and the soil in the coffins and the graves, and some of the coffins remained where they were, held by the weight of the earth above them and the roots of the trees and the specific resistance of the ground to being lifted, and some of the coffins were carried by the storm surge from the cemetery to the streets of the city, and from the streets of the city to the Gulf side of the island, and from the Gulf side of the island into the Gulf of Mexico, where the withdrawing surge took them and where the currents of the Gulf of Mexico received them. The lead-lined coffin of Charles Francis Coghlan, actor, native of Prince Edward Island, dead of November of the preceding year, was among the coffins that were carried. Its specific journey out of the cemetery and through the destroyed city and into the Gulf is not documented. No one survived who watched it happen, or no one who watched it happen survived to document it in a form that has come down to the record. What is documented is what the fishermen of St. Peter's Bay Prince Edward Island, found 8 years later on the red sand shore of the bay where the man in the coffin had been born. But between the hurricane and the fishermen there were 2,000 miles of open water. Wood remembers the water. The Gulf of Mexico received the coffin in the first days after the hurricane, when the storm had passed and the sea had returned to its post-hurricane state, which is the specific agitated calm of an ocean that has just done something enormous and is settling back into itself. The swell still significant, but the direction no longer the wall of the storm surge. Now the ordinary swell, the long rhythmic swell that the Gulf produces in the period after a major system when the energy of the storm is still in the water, but distributed differently, not the concentrated horror of landfall, but the wide distributed aftermath that takes days to subside. In this aftermath, the coffin wrote, it was lead lined, which made it heavy, and it was sealed, which made it relatively watertight, and the combination of lead lining and sealed lid produced in it the specific buoyancy of something that is heavy enough to ride low in the water, but light enough in proportion to its displacement to remain at the surface rather than sinking. The buoyancy of the lead-lined coffin was the accident of its construction that the legend turns on, the specific piece of craft that a Victorian coffin maker had applied as a matter of proper burial practice, and that became, in the aftermath of the hurricane, the physical property that made the journey possible. It rode low. In the swell of the Gulf after the hurricane, it was visible from above as a dark shape in the great green water, moving with the direction of the swell, riding the aftermath of the storm. What was also moving in the direction of the swell was the current. The Gulf of Mexico has its own circulatory system, the loop current that enters the Gulf through the Yucatan Channel and circles the Gulf's interior before exiting through the Florida Straits. And in the agitation of the post-hurricane Gulf, the currents that are always present became more expressed, more powerful, more clearly directional. The coffin moved with the current the way debris moves with current. Not because it was navigating, not because it was choosing a direction, but because the direction was given to it by the water it was in, which was water with its own agenda, its own ancient and uninterruptible path. The loop current carried it eastward, toward the Florida Straits. The Florida Straits delivered it to the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is the most powerful ocean current on Earth. It is a river of warm water that runs from the Gulf of Mexico northward along the eastern coast of North America, and then curves northeast across the Atlantic toward the British Isles, moving at speeds that vary between 3 and 6 miles per hour in its core, and that carry a volume of water approximately 300 times greater than the combined flow of all the rivers of the world. It has been flowing in this direction since the North Atlantic formed in its current configuration, approximately 30 million years ago. It does not ask for permission. It does not accommodate alternative routes. It moves in the direction. It has always moved with the authority of a geological process that no hurricane and no human institution has ever interrupted, and that will continue after the last human institution has concluded its operations. The coffin entered the Gulf Stream in the autumn of 1900. In the Gulf Stream it moved northeast along the road that the stream has always taken, past the Carolinas and Virginia in the shipping lanes of the mid-Atlantic seaboard. It moved in the specific company of the Gulf Stream's waters, warmer than the surrounding ocean, which is the Gulf Stream's defining characteristic, the river of warmth that makes the British Isles habitable at latitudes that without the Gulf Stream would produce a climate closer to Labrador's. In this warm water the coffin rode low, moving in the direction the water moved, indifferent to the weather above it, indifferent to the seasons that passed above it, as the winter of 1900 became the spring of 1901, and the spring became the summer. In the summer of 1901, when it had been in the Gulf Stream for perhaps 8 months, it was somewhere east of the Georges Bank, in the deep water where the continental shelf falls away to the real depth of the Atlantic. The water here is a different color from the water closer to shore, a deep blue that is the color of very deep water, the color of water that has not been disturbed by the presence of the bottom in its color or its temperature, the specific deep blue of the open Atlantic that sailors have been writing about since sailors first crossed the Atlantic and found that the blue of the deep was different from every other blue. The coffin was in this blue. It was moving northeast, and the days were getting longer because it was summer, and the long days of a North Atlantic summer have a specific quality that the deep blue of the open ocean intensifies, a white quality. Almost, the light diffuse and very even, coming from a sky that at high latitudes in summer is never fully dark. The twilight extending far into what should be the night hours, and the dawn beginning earlier than the body expects. In this light the coffin's dark wood was very dark, and the silver plate on its lid was very faint, and the barnacles that had begun to accumulate on the plate and on the lower surfaces of the wood were the beginning of the ocean's slow claim on an object that had been in its possession for almost a year. But the ocean was carrying it, not claiming it. The ocean was taking it somewhere. There is a woman in the legend of Charles Coghlan's coffin who does not have a name in any of the published accounts, because the published accounts are interested in the coffin, and not in the watchers, and the watchers are always the part of a legend that the legend finds least important, and that I find most important, because the watchers are the people who were there, who saw what happened, who know what the experience of being present at something extraordinary is like, which is usually nothing like what the subsequent legend makes of it. In this account she has a name. Her name is Eliza. She was the keeper of the night watch at the lighthouse at the eastern point of St. Peter's Bay, Prince Edward Island, in the years after the death of the lighthouse keeper who was her father, who had done this work for 30 years, and who had taught her everything he knew about the light and the bay and the specific navigation hazards of the St. Lawrence Gulf's approach to the red sand shore of the island. She had been doing the night watch since she was 20, first with her father, and then without him. And she knew the bay the way you know a thing you have been watching every night for 20 years, which is to say she knew it in the dark. She knew its sounds and its moods, and the specific way the tide moved through it at different states of the moon, and she knew what belonged in it and what did not. She was 40 years old in the October of 1908, the October when the coffin arrived. She saw it in the early morning, when the light was just beginning, the specific gray light of a Prince Edward Island October dawn, which is a cold light and a flat light and a light that shows the surface of the water very clearly because there is no warmth in it to create the haze that warm light produces. She saw a shape on the red sand of the shore below the lighthouse point, a dark shape that the tide had brought in and deposited at the high water mark in the night, that she had not seen in the dark, but that the growing light was beginning to resolve from a darkness on darkness into a thing with specific edges. She went down to the shore. The path from the lighthouse to the shore was a path she had walked 10,000 times, and she walked it now, in the October dawn with the cold wind coming off the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the smell of the cold water and the red sand visible in the growing light, and she came to the high water mark, and she stood looking at the shape before she understood what she was looking at. It was a coffin on the shore of Prince Edward Island, brought in by the tide. High water marked by the night's tide, on the red sand, lying on its side, where the tide had left it. The wood very dark and salt encrusted and swollen from long immersion and covered on its underside and along its lower edges with the barnacles and the marine growth that accumulate on anything that has been in salt water long enough. She looked at it and she noted everything about it in the specific way of a woman who has spent 20 years making accurate observations of things at sea. And then she went to her knees in the red sand, and she wiped the salt from the silver plate on the coffin's lid with the cloth she had in her pocket for the lens, and she read the name. She could read only part of it. 8 years of the Atlantic had done what 8 years of the Atlantic does to silver that is not being polished, and the salt crystal, and the marine growth, and the oxidation of the silver had reduced the legibility of the engraving to specific letters and not others, to the first of the surname, and several letters of the given name, and the date of death beneath, which was legible as 1899. She read what she could read. She stood up. She looked at the bay, and the gulf beyond it in the October dawn, the water gray and cold, and the shore red, and the coffin black on the red sand, and she stood there for a long time, not yet doing anything, except being there with what had arrived. The fishermen came at first light, as they always did, for the boats in the bay, and she met them on the path and told them what was on the shore, and they came with her, and they stood with her, and looked at the coffin. One of the fishermen was a man named Angus MacDonald, who was 60 years old, and who had been born at St. Peter's Bay, and had lived there his whole life, and who knew the history of the bay, and the people who had come from it, which was a long history, and a specific one, the specific history of an island that had been home to Acadian French and Scottish and Irish settlers across 2 centuries of difficult and particular fortune, and who knew the name Coghlan, because the Coghlans had been part of that history, and Charles Coghlan had been a famous man, and the island did not forget its famous men, especially the ones who had left and made something of the leaving. He looked at the silver plate. He read what Eliza had read. He stood up from his knees, and he looked at the other fisherman, and he said, "That is Charles Coghlan." Nobody said anything else for a while. Then one of the younger men said, "How did it get here?" Angus said, "The same way everything gets here that belongs here." He said this with the flat certainty of a man from a fishing community who has spent his whole life watching the sea move things according to its own arrangement, and who has never found the sea's arrangement surprising, even when it is extraordinary. Because the sea's arrangement has its own logic, and the logic is the logic of the currents, and the tides, and the wind, and those things are noble, even when their conclusions are startling. He said, "It came home." He said it the way you state a fact that is simply true. The coffin of Charles Coghlan had traveled from Galveston to Prince Edward Island. It had been in the open ocean for approximately 8 years, which is the calculation derived from the date of the hurricane, September 8, 1900, and the date of the discovery, which is estimated from the circumstantial evidence at approximately October of 1908, a period of 8 years and approximately 1 month. In that period, it had moved from the Gulf of Mexico through the Florida Straits and into the Gulf Stream and northeast along the Gulf Stream's path, and then, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic or in the water south of Newfoundland, it had come off the Gulf Stream's main axis and been caught in one of the subsidiary currents that the Gulf Stream generates as it moves. The eddies and side currents that spin off the main flow the way a fast river generates side currents in its bends, and been carried northwest into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and through the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the mouth of St. Peter's Bay, and on the night of the arrival up the bay on the rising tide and deposited at the high water mark on the red sand shore. The distance from Galveston to St. Peter's Bay is approximately 2,000 miles. This is not the distance the Coffin traveled, which was considerably greater, because the path of the Gulf Stream is not a straight line between the Gulf of Mexico and the Canadian Maritimes, but a curve that goes far out into the mid-Atlantic before bending north. The total distance traveled was closer to 4,000 or 5,000 miles, which the 8 years of travel at the Gulf Stream's average speed of 3 to 4 miles per hour in the currents that would have carried the Coffin is not inconsistent with a calculation complicated by the fact that the Gulf Stream speed varies, that the Coffin would have spent time in the eddies and backwaters of the current rather than the core, that the final leg of the journey through the Gulf of St. Lawrence would have been in slower water, and that the timing of the arrival at the bay would have depended on the tides and the wind in the final approach. All of this is the oceanographic accounting of a journey that the ocean made without reference to the accountant, because the ocean does not need to justify its routes. The specific accounting is the journalist's concern. The miracle, or the legend, or the extraordinary coincidence, or whatever you prefer to call it, depending on what category you are working in, is this. Of all the places on the Atlantic coast of North America and Canada and the British Isles and Ireland and Norway and Iceland and the other places that the Gulf Stream has the potential to deliver things, the coffin of Charles Coghlan arrived at St. Peter's Bay, Prince Edward Island, the place where Charles Coghlan was born. The newspaper correspondent who came from Charlottetown to write the story about the coffin arrived 3 days after Eliza had found it on the shore. The coffin had by this point been moved to the shed of the harbor master's office in the village of St. Peter's, where it waited for the various official processes that a coffin found on a beach initiates: the verification of the identity of the remains, the notification of any living relatives, the decisions about reburial. The correspondent was a young man from a newspaper in the provincial capital, 24 years old, ambitious in the specific way of young provincial journalists who understand that the story they have come to write is the story that could take them somewhere, and who balance this understanding against the genuine strange sadness of the specific thing they have come to write about, which was the balance you could see in him when he stood in the harbor master's shed looking at the coffin. He interviewed Eliza. He interviewed Angus MacDonald. He interviewed the other fishermen who had been at the shore. He interviewed the harbor master and the local priest and the postmaster, who in small maritime communities is always a key figure in any matter of local significance. He wrote the interviews in his notebook in the shorthand he had learned at the correspondence school in Charlottetown, and he was meticulous and thorough and young. And when he had finished the interviews, he stood at the door of the harbor master's shed in the October afternoon and looked at the shed that contained the coffin. He had one more interview to conduct. He had not planned to conduct it. It was not in the plan of the article, as he had conceived it in Charlottetown, which was a plan for a human interest story about a remarkable oceanographic coincidence with a local connection. The kind of story that maritime newspapers ran when the sea produced something extraordinary, and the extraordinary thing had a name that local readers would recognize. He went into the shed. He stood next to the coffin. He put his notebook in his pocket, and his pencil in the same pocket, and he stood there in the cold of the shed in the October afternoon, and he was 24 years old, and he had never stood next to an open ocean coffin before, and the specific experience of it was producing in him a question that his training as a journalist had not given him the vocabulary for. He said, very quietly to no one in particular or to the coffin specifically, which amounts in this context to the same thing. How? He did not mean how in the oceanographic sense. He had the oceanographic sense from the interviews. He meant how in the other sense, the sense that the oceanographic explanation does not close, the sense that persists after you have accounted for the loop current and the Gulf Stream and the eddies, and the tidal approach descent, Heaters Bay and the specific buoyancy of a lead-lined Victorian coffin in salt water. He meant of everything that could have happened and did not happen. The coffin sinking in a hurricane surge, the coffin breaking up in the open ocean, the coffin going to the bottom on the continental shelf, the coffin traveling the Gulf Stream to Iceland or Norway or Scotland, the coffin continuing through the Gulf of St. Lawrence past Prince Edward Island to Newfoundland, or the Labrador coast. Of all the things that could have happened and did not happen, how is it that the one thing that did happen is this? The coffin on this shore, his shore. He stood in the shed for a long time. Then he went outside, and he looked at the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which was grey and cold and entirely indifferent to the question, which was the appropriate response of the sea to questions of this kind, which is to say no response at all, because the sea does not answer questions. The sea simply moves. It moves what it is given, and it puts what it is given where it puts it, and it does not explain its routing. And if the routing happens to be from the place where a man died to the place where the man was born, the sea's non-explanation of this routing is exactly as satisfying and exactly as unsatisfying as the sea's non-explanation of every other routing it has ever made, because the sea does not distinguish between the remarkable and the unremarkable in its decisions about where to put things. The sea simply puts things where the current takes them, and the current took him home. The legend of Charles Coghlan's coffin has been disputed since it was first widely circulated in the early years of the 20th century. The disputes are reasonable disputes. The silver plate on the coffin, which is the primary evidence of identification, was reportedly too encrusted to be fully legible at the time of discovery, and the partial legibility left room for interpretation that may or may not have been filled by the local knowledge that Charles Coghlan was the most famous person who had ever left St. Heaters Bay. The physical condition of a lined coffin after 8 years in open salt water is a matter on which the available evidence is ambiguous. The oceanographic plausibility of the journey has been both asserted and contested by people who know more about ocean currents than either of the people doing the asserting or contesting, and the plausibility appears to be within the range of what the Gulf Stream and its tributaries could accomplish, given enough time and specific current conditions, without being definitely established as what happened. The legend is a legend. This is not the same as saying it is not true. It is saying that the evidence is the evidence of a legend rather than the evidence of a documentary record, which means it has the specific weight of something that has been told and retold, and that has survived the retelling in a way that things survive the retelling when they contain something essential that the telling preserves. The essential thing in the legend of Charles Coghlan's coffin is not the oceanographic fact, which may or may not be exactly as described. The essential thing is the idea of a return, the idea that the dead can be taken from the place of their death by the water and carried back to the place of their beginning, that the sea has in its immense patient movement something that functions like a preference for a rightness, for the resolution of the specific wrongness of a man buried 2,000 miles from where he was born. The idea of return, the idea that the earth, or the water, which is the earth's other surface, the earth's older self, knows something about where things belong and will, given enough time and the right current, put them where they belong. This idea is old. It is older than the legend of Charles Coghlan, and older than the Gulf Stream, and older than the Atlantic Ocean, which is itself the youngest of the major ocean basins. Young in geological terms, young enough that the civilizations of the continents it now separates developed alongside its formation and have stories about the time before the separation and about the waters that divided the world. The idea that water returns what it receives to the place it belongs is in every culture that has ever lived beside the water, which is most cultures, because most of the world's people have always lived near water, near the river or the lake or the ocean, whose movement is the most visible metaphor available for the passage of time and the persistence of return. The water moves. The water returns. The water eventually brings things back, whether it brought Charles Coghlan back or not, whether the coffin that Eliza found on the red sand shore of St. Heaters Bay in October of 1908 was in fact the lead-lined coffin of the man whose name is on the silver plate, whether the 8-year journey from Galveston to Prince Edward Island actually happened as the legend describes it, whether all of this is factual, or is the kind of true that is truer than fact, the truth of a story that the people who needed the story needed it to tell, The legend persists. It persists because the idea at its center is one that people need. The idea that the sea knows where you belong. The idea that what is taken from the place of your origin by violence and distance, and the accidents of a life lived far from home, can be returned. That the return is not impossible. That the current has a destination in mind for what it carries. That the patience of water is ultimately a patient moving toward brightness. The red sand shore of St. Peter's Bay is still red. The Gulf Stream still runs. The Gulf of Mexico still generates its hurricanes in the specific season of hurricanes, and some of them still cross the low ground of the Texas coast and lift what is in that ground and carry it back to the sea. The sea still moves. The sea still knows. In the first week of November 1900, a few weeks after the Galveston hurricane, a woman named Ida Crane, who lived in a house on the water at St. Peter's Bay, Prince Edward Island, who had been born there and who intended to die there, and who had spent 70 of her 80 years watching the Gulf of St. Lawrence from the same window of the same house, told her granddaughter something that she had known since she was a girl. She said, "The water gives back what it takes." She said, "Not right away." She said, "The water has its own schedule and it keeps its schedule, and what it gives back when it is ready, and you cannot rush it, and you cannot predict it, and you cannot know in advance what it will bring in." She said, "But it brings in." She said, "I have watched this bay for 70 years and I know." Her granddaughter asked her, "What has it brought in?" Ida sat by the window, and she looked at the bay, which was in November the specific gray of the Gulf of St. Lawrence in November, which is a specific gray that is different from any other gray in the world, the gray of cold water and cold sky and the last of the year's light draining into the south. She watched the bay for a while, then she said, "Things you didn't know were missing." She said, "That's the thing about the water. It brings in things you didn't know were missing. You didn't know they were lost. And then one morning, you walk down to the shore, and there they are, and you understand that they were missing all along, that the missing had been there the whole time, and now the missing is over." She said, "That is the best thing the water does." She looked at the bay for another while. Then she said, "Now help me make tea." Her granddaughter made the tea. The bay went on being gray. 8 years later, on a morning in October, Eliza would walk down to the red sand shore in the early light, and there would be a shape at the high water mark that the night's tide had brought in, and she would wipe the salt from the silver plate, and she would read the name, and she would understand. The missing had been there the whole time. Now the missing was over. The coffin of Charles Coghlan, or the coffin that the people of St. Peter's Bay believed was the coffin of Charles Coghlan, was eventually reburied in the cemetery at St. Peter's in the red soil of Prince Edward Island, under a stone that sat where he was from, and when he was born, and when he died, and nothing about where he had been in the years between. The stone says, "Charles Francis Coghlan, born here, at Galveston, Texas, November 27, 1899. There is no date for the return. There is no mention of the hurricane, or the Gulf Stream, or the 8 years in the open Atlantic. The stone says only born here, which is true, and died there, which is true, and leaves out everything that happened between the death and the return, which was the water's business, and which the water did not need carved in stone to account for, because the water had been accounting for it in its own way since September of 1900, and the accounting was complete, and the stone was simply the marker for the return, which the water had already made, and which the stone was not needed to arrange. He is in the red soil of Prince Edward Island. He is where he is from. The water brought him home. This is the account of what the wood remembers, which is the cold and the dark and the moving, which is the specific patience of something being carried by something vast and indifferent, and in this case, somehow, directional. The wood does not remember the hurricane, because by the time the hurricane came, the wood had been in the ground for 9 months, and the ground was doing what the ground does, which is slowly incorporating what is in it, and what the hurricane interrupted was this slow incorporation, which means the wood went from the ground back to the open air, and then to the water before the ground had finished its work, which means the wood was returned to the water before it was the ground's. The water received it. The water was the right archivist for this piece of history, because the water's archive does not keep things in one place, and does not require a fixed address, and does not hold against the dead that they died somewhere other than where they were born. The water's archive moves. It receives and it carries, and it delivers, and it puts things down where the current and the tide and the long patience of the ocean's circulation determine they should be put down, and sometimes, not always, not often, but sometimes, in the specific cases where the current's path and the geography of origin are in the right relationship to each other, what it puts down is in the right place. Charles Coghlan was born at St. Peter's Bay, Prince Edward Island. The Gulf Stream runs northeast from the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of St. Lawrence opens on the south toward the Atlantic. St. Peter's Bay opens on the north toward the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The water brought him home. This is the whole of the account. This is what the wood knows.